So I'm gonna try this video again now that I turned the music down.
In April of 2026, the United States
how
government carried
this
a
sounds
national
against
debt of
music on my
$39
voice.
trillion.
Yes,
That figure
this can
climbs
be
by
you
roughly
clearly,
$7.5
might
billion
talk
every
over
single
it to
day.
the
Net
channel
interest
now.
payments on that
This
debt
is the
alone
experience.
now exceed $1 trillion per year, more than the country spends on its entire military. Every American household owes a silent share of about
Yeah, but think about that for a second. How much our debt is getting out of control. It's more than our military now. The interest payments. Just paying interest on our debt is higher than our military budget.
$289,000 that no household ever agreed to borrow. That same month, the Cato Institute released polling data showing that 62% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 25 held a favorable view of socialism. 34% held a favorable view of communism. 40% of women in that same age group now identify as liberal, compared to 25% of men, the widest political gender gap ever recorded in the 24-year.
It's hard to imagine a number that big, so like, that's the thing. I was, like, there's this one comment Elon Musk made about having $1 trillion of revenue, and I was trying to explain to people the absurdity of what that actually entails. Like, you're talking about, like, there's only like 15 or 20 countries in the whole world with GDP higher than that, and these are GDP of our entire countries. It's like really ridiculous, and like, heck, so more of an understanding people have with numbers this large.
History of its ideology series. A generation is about to inherit the most indebted state in human history. And that same generation, especially its young women, is telling pollsters the solution is more government, not less. Pollsters keep hearing demands for universal health care, free college, student debt cancellation, housing subsidies, and a vastly expanded welfare state, all financed by a treasury already drowning in interest payments on borrowed money before any of those voters were born. The historical record on the system these voters are asking for is not ambiguous, though. Every comprehensive attempt at state ownership of production in the 20th century ended in some combination of famine, hyperinflation, refugee exodus, or mass death. Credible estimates put the total body count somewhere between 65 and 100 million human beings. The Soviet Union collapsed. Mao Zedong.
I actually not sure how clear this talking point it is about how many people died under socialism, trying to shift to communism, which the communism part never took place. But you know, you can say people died under capitalism too. It's like, not sure how. I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure how fair this argument for body count is. I'm not sure if I totally agree with that. I think it's a little, like, a little deflective, but it's still okay, has a point at the same time. Because the thing is, if you're having an economic system where that encourages poverty and people are dying for that, you still have to put that fully in argument. So it's way tricky.
and produced the deadliest famine in recorded history. Venezuela, a country sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, now watches its citizens eat zoo animals. North Koreans have been starving on and off for 30
why
years.
this comment right here as well as it's talking about this economic system, socialism, and such a poor, the poor economic state people are trying to do their best just to find food. So, having remarked on how many people died on that is justified. At the same time, it can be kind of misleading too, because you can say, blah blah, all these people, they are on capitalism. You can do the whataboutism for each. But it does have a point here, because you're not having...
Cubans had been rationing bread since the early 1960s. East Germany built a wall to keep its own people from fleeing west. None of that history appears in the feeds of the young women voting for it. So the question this documentary will answer is not whether socialism works. The evidence on that is settled. The real puzzle is why the most educated, most connected, most informed generation in human history has chosen to forget. This is the story of why socialism always fails, why an entire generation of Western women are embracing it anyway, and where the collision between those two facts is about to take the rest of the world. The first problem in every conversation about socialism is that
The thing that ideological gap that he talks about, that's actually not limited to U.S. And I think he talks about that later, where it's like worldwide there's a huge gender gap in, bottom right.
almost no one in the conversation actually agrees on what the word means. In 2018, Gallup asked Americans to define socialism in their own words. Only 17% gave the classical academic definition, meaning government ownership or control of the means of production. 23% defined it as equality. Others defined it as free healthcare, free college, government benefits, or the Nordic countries. 4 years earlier, Reason magazine ran a poll that captured the same confusion with brutal efficiency. 42% of millennials said they liked socialism. Only 16% could correctly define it, though. 64% of the same group said they wanted a free market economy. The same people were cheering for two opposite systems in the same breath. This is the linguistic swap.
So he's talking about how, people are unable to define what socialism is in the first place, and why there's, sentiment, I guess it's right. All the same logistic, issues of trying to communicate what you want to begin with. Semantics, yeah, semantics, I was trying to say semantics. So, like he even said, people want a free market, but they want socialism. It doesn't make sense because the technical definitions conflict with each other. So that's what he's referring to.
Every socialism debate begins with. Supporters picture Denmark, critics picture Venezuela, and both sides are correct about their own picture, and both sides are talking past each other. Denmark, for the record, is not socialist. The Danish Prime Minister said so to an American audience in his own voice. On October 29th of 2015, with Bernie Sanders running for the Democratic nomination and telling voters that Denmark was the model, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the sitting Prime Minister of Denmark, traveled to Hartford's Kennedy School and delivered one of the most politically inconvenient sentences of the decade. Rasmussen told the audience, Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Rasmussen was not correcting a fringe academic. He was correcting the most famous American politician of the socialist revival. And he was right. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Iceland ranked in the top 15 on the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. Denmark ranks higher than the United States. Sweden has operated a nationwide school voucher program since 1992. The ones many Democrats are against in the United States. Norway abolished its estate tax in 2014. The estate tax that the Democrats
Sometimes data like that can be useful, but I'm very wary, generally speaking, when it comes to Heritage Foundation references, because if you give them the correct moment to give you propaganda, they'll give you propaganda. And mild statistics that would benefit their talking points. Basically, they're a think tank to get people like Elon Musk more money. So it's like but at the same time, that statistic he repeated from them does make sense, but it's just something to think about. Maybe we'll consider your source sometimes.
Advocate for in the United States. And then Sweden abolished its wealth tax in 2007. You know, the tax that Democrats in California currently want to implement. The Nordic countries fund their generous welfare states with value-added taxes of roughly 25% that hit every citizen at the checkout counter, and with income taxes whose top brackets begin at income levels that would be considered middle class in America. The entire system runs on the productivity of open, competitive, privately owned capitalist economies. The welfare state is the second floor. The capitalist market is the foundation. Tear out that foundation and the second floor comes with it.
See, this is a thing that people need to understand more, is that if you want better safety nets and welfare, which I think we should have, people on the limited side, yeah, they have to pay more in taxes. But at the same time, there should be some relief, if you're paying 25% lower tax or whatever, you shouldn't be expected to pay 20% tips, because everyone should be being paid fairly at that point. So that you shouldn't have the toxic tipping culture at that point. And that's the other thing. People like these countries, especially there, they don't have tipping culture like we do. They actually pay their service employees,
Actual socialism, the version that has been tried repeatedly for over 100 years, looks very different. The playbook includes nationalizing factories, farms, banks, and resources, replacing market prices with central planning, and eliminating or severely restricting private property in capital goods. The Soviet Union ran this full program. Maoist China followed. Cuba, North Korea, and Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge implemented their own versions. Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro reran the experiment in Venezuela. Every single one of those experiments failed. And an honest documentary has to ask why they keep failing, and why they keep failing in exactly the same way.
If you or your child spent years growing up on social media and experienced serious mental health struggles, you should...
Yeah, I agree with the idea that social media. This is an ad for his thing, but yeah, there he's like saying how platforms like Meta and X, I guess, maybe. Or like under like fire.
Hear this.
You know,
Recently, a jury
was
ordered
fire.
Meta and YouTube to pay millions for their role in designing and promoting addictive platforms. They knew their apps could contribute to anxiety, depression, and body image issues, but did not share those risks while prioritizing profits. The recent historic verdict underscores the consequences of those decisions. Now Morgan & Morgan is stepping up to hold these platforms accountable for the harm they caused. Click the link in my bio to take a short quiz. You may be entitled to a potential recovery of over $1,000. In
So
1920,
it's
the
you
then
know, it's a
obscure
lot.
Austrian
It's so
economist
good
named
information
Ludwig
regarding
von
this.
Mises
It'd
published
be
an
like,
essay
hey, there's
titled
this
Economic
lawsuit going
Calculation
on,
in
and
the
these
Socialist Commonwealth. Mises argued that socialism would fail.
and these social media companies. Why not see if you qualify you? But yeah, it's really stupid of what social media companies do to get their clickbaity stuff out. And this stems to our conversation earlier. Like, you know, you have rage bait titles, I mean, that are not really honest to the real issue at hand, just because you want more clicks. Or telling everyone Nazi, and you're like, oh my god, this person's a Nazi. Click my video and to see why.
At the deepest level. The system was mathematically impossible. A modern economy contains millions of people making billions of decisions every day about what to build, what to grow, what to ship, what to consume, what to save. No individual human being, no committee, no government agency, no bureaucracy can personally know the answers to those billions of questions. Nobody in Moscow knew how much copper the factory in Vladivostok needed in a given week. A planner in Beijing had no way to know how many tomatoes the village in Sichuan could spare. In a market economy, nobody has to know. Prices do the work. A shortage of copper pushes the price of copper up, and every copper user on Earth receives that information at the same moment and adjusts. A farmer producing too many tomatoes watches the price drop and plants fewer tomatoes next season. Prices aggregate the knowledge of billions.
This is the reason why we actually need regulations, even in a system like that, like what he's explaining, he's explaining capitalism. Yeah, and in theory, without corruption, that's how things work. If you overproduce something, the supply rises and prices fall. And because the prices fall, you'll produce less eventually. But the thing is, you can also price fix where you don't have to produce as much. You'll be like, you go to your competitors and you're like, hey, make less of this stuff. So there's less of it, and we can sell it for more. So that's why we have regulations. The thing is, early United States was more of a strong capitalist country. And the result of that was getting people poison food, they had no say, and having one person to control the transportation. You know, and that did not pay well. But that's why the oil company was ordered to break up the Rockefeller and his train. Yeah, I mix up names, but you know, you have people like Rockefeller and and you have all this control over the train routes and tolls and whatever. You have one person controlling the flow of the country because you have a monopoly over those railroads. So yeah, capitalism advice in theory until someone takes ownership of everything.
Of strangers into a single number that any shopkeeper or engineer can read. Under socialism, the state owns the factories, the farms, the mines, and the machines. No market exists for capital goods because there are no private buyers and no private sellers. With no buyers and sellers, there are no prices, and planners have nothing to calculate with. The central committee is flying blind. Friedrich Hayek, Mises' younger colleague, extended the argument in a 1945 paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society. Hayek added a second dimension to the critique. Knowledge, Hayek wrote, is not centralized. Knowledge is dispersed. It lives in the heads of millions of individuals, and most of it cannot be written down. A farmer in rural Ukraine knows his soil. A factory foreman in the Urals knows which of his machines is about to break. A shopkeeper in Odessa knows which customers pay on time. No central planner can collect that knowledge, and even the best planner could not process it. Markets process it automatically through the price signal. Socialism destroys the price.
The issue with that specifically, that's actually changing with more technology and I had to say it, AI. So are you with Walmart? Like Walmart? Are you kind of aware like their fast structure and everything? Just curious, so what do you know about Walmart? You might be interested to what I have to say in there. Okay. Explain, tell me in your words what you think about Walmart. Like, how is it successful? Walmart. Walmart, the store chain Walmart. It's such. You know the big store? Walmart. How do you think they're successful? They balance supply and demand topics. So yeah. So what? So the thing with retail in general, what they used to do, when the store started selling stuff, there was some inefficiency there. So what they came up with is having a third instead of going from producer to consumer directly, there's a middleman. And what this middleman was, they would continuously buy from the producer, so the producer was happy because they had something to sell to. The middleman was able to buy everything. And then the middleman would distribute to different signers on different products because they had data of where to ship stuff to, and they knew how much supply and demand there was. And then Walmart comes along, and they become their own middleman. Like they have immense amounts of data of how like shopper tendencies and what people are gonna buy. So they're basically predicting of how much stuff they're gonna sell. So they're not gonna have a supply or shortage. So the thing is about he's talking about, like, no one knows, no central database knows how much stuff to produce. Well, Walmart kinda knows with all their data. That's how they do what you said. They balance supply and demand, and that they do so with all that data they have. Walmart has immense amount of data. It's actually amazing if you research that. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. AI will improve on that further.
A signal and throws the knowledge away. The Mises' argument was mathematical, not philosophical. And for 70 years, the Soviet Union ran the experiment that proved it. The Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in October of 1917, promising peace, land, and bread. Over the following decade, they nationalized industry, banned private trade, and shot the peasants who resisted. In 1929, Joseph Stalin launched the first 5-year plan. In 1932, he launched the second. Collectivization of agriculture was central to both. Small farmers were forced off their land and herded into collective farms owned by the state. The peasants who refused were shot, deported, or starved. The famine that followed, known as the Holodomor, killed between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933. Soviet grain was seized from starving villages and exported abroad to pay for industrial machinery, while the people who grew the grain ate their own dogs. The historian Timothy Schneider, using Soviet archives opened after 1991, later documented that Stalin was aware of the scale of the death and ordered the grain seizures continued anyway. The Gulag system absorbed millions more. At a peak operation, roughly 1.8 million people were imprisoned in Soviet labor camps. Another 1.5 to 1.8 million died inside them. Millions more were executed outright during the Great Purge of 1937 and 1938. The Black Book of Communism, a 1997 academic collection published by Harvard University Press, put the total death toll under Soviet rule at roughly 20.
See, this is the where I was getting at, where there is some of the ballot period vacancies, like, where it's ballot to talk about deaths under communism because, or socialism, sorry, because the way that socialism is structured, you have to call resources from people to do your goal, and that feeding your population results in deaths that you have to document against that system.
Million. Other scholars working independently put the number closer to 15 million. Either figure dwarfs the body count of any government in the Western Hemisphere in the same period. The economic record was almost just as dark. Soviet prices were set by committee, not by markets. And by 1985, the State Price Bureau was reviewing roughly 200,000 prices per year. A functioning modern economy needs roughly 20 million prices updated continuously. The gap between what the state could set and what the economy actually needed was filled by shortages, black markets, and waiting lists. Gennady Gerasimov, the spokesman for Mikhail Gorbachev, told a joke in the late 1980s that captured the situation. The Soviet Union, Gerasimov said, would one day conquer every country on Earth except one. The Soviets would leave New Zealand alone, so that there would be at least one remaining country left to tell them the market price of goods. Soviet factories routinely received orders that made no sense. In 1933, a factory called the Dzerzhinsky Works, originally built to produce window glass, received a state derivative to switch production to dairy products and fish. Workers had no training, no equipment, and no cows. But they complied because refusing meant prison. Planners priced nails by weight in 1 year, which produced factories churning out a small number of enormous nails that nobody could hammer. The next year, they priced nails by count, which produced factories churning out thousands of tiny nails so small that no one could use those either. The East German Trabant, the iconic socialist automobile, was built from a recycled plastic resin called Duroplast because steel was perpetually short. Customers waited up to 16 years to buy one. The car had no fuel pump because the socialist engineers could not source one reliably. So fuel flowed into the engine by gravity from a tank mounted above it. By 1991, the whole system was finished. The Soviet budget deficit hit 34% of GDP. Internal trade among the Soviet republics collapsed by 83% in 18 months. The USSR formally dissolved on December 26th of 1991, 74 years after the revolution that was supposed to last forever. The Soviet story is terrible, but the Chinese story is worse. In 1958, Mao Zedong announced the Great.
So it was explaining the effects of having one central committee rule over everything. They end up telling people to make stuff that had nothing to do with what they knew, like their expertise. You can't tell farmer that milks cows to make glass or what. Yeah, I was in Foley. taking the fine details, but I think you get the point. Yeah, a lot of people don't understand and force you to keep up top secret ways, something like that. The other thing is, like he explained earlier, is it's more some sentimental. I can't say the word again. He said earlier, but even people like Bernie Sanders, he's not literally up there saying we need to have the state with the means of production. He's just talking about like how Nordic countries are built. But that doesn't mean accepting the idea of paying more taxes. People have to get that to their head. You have to pay for it somehow. That's where the major disconnect is. And people put monies, I guess. You gotta pay more taxes.
Leap forward. The plan was to transform China from a peasant society into an industrial superpower in 15 years and to surpass Britain's steel production along the way. To accomplish this, Mao ordered every village to...
Which, to be fair, I actually think it should be that way. But, like I said, you have to accept the idea, like everyone has to accept ideas of paying more taxes. And then you can logically reasons on why rich people should pay their fair share and not exploit the loopholes they get to exploit. But yeah.
Built its own backyard steel furnace. Peasants were told to melt down their cooking pots, their farm tools, their door hinges, and anything else made of metal. The resulting output was mostly useless pig iron that could not be shaped into anything productive. Because the peasants were melting their tools instead of farming, grain production collapsed. Because local Communist Party officials feared being purged for reporting bad news, they falsified their grain totals upward. And because the central government believed the falsified totals, it ordered the state to collect even more grain from the villages. The grain that did not exist was collected anyway, and anything the peasants had hidden was seized. By 1959, villages across central China were starving. Then came the sparrows. In the same period, Mao launched the Four Pest Campaign. Sparrows, along with rats, flies, and mosquitoes, were declared enemies of the revolution because they ate grain. Millions of Chinese citizens were mobilized to kill every sparrow they could find. Children banged pots under trees until the birds died of exhaustion. Villages tallied their sparrows' kills as a patriotic contribution. But the planners had overlooked a minor ecological detail. Sparrows also ate locusts. With the sparrow population destroyed, locust swarms descended on what remained of the crops and consumed them. The result was the deadliest famine in recorded human history. The historian Frank de Carter spent years inside China Provincial Archives opened after 2004.
This is a good example of why one person should not be doing decisions, because they'll overlook something with that. It's like, wait, don't kill the sparrows because there's locusts. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? The sparrows are bad, you're an idiot, blah 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 blah. That's how the exchange would go.
And documented a death toll of at least 45 million people between 1958 and 1962. Yang Jisheng, a Chinese state journalist granted archival access, published a separate estimate of 36 million. 2.5 million of those deaths, according to de Carter's files, were not from starvation, but from beatings, torture, and execution for the crime of resisting grain seizures. Mao, confronted with the scale of the deaths, reportedly responded that half of China might well have to die. During the worst year of the famine, 1959, China continued to export 4.2 tons of grain abroad. Socialist ideology required that the revolution be seen to succeed, and admitting failure was not permitted. 16 years later, in 1976, Mao died. 2 years after that, a new Chinese leader named Deng Xiaoping began quietly reversing almost everything Mao had done. Deng let peasants farm their own plots again. Private businesses were legalized. Special economic zones were created where foreign capital could invest. Deng did not call any of this capitalism. He called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. But everyone who watched it happen understood exactly what it was. In 1978, approximately 88% of China's population lived in extreme poverty. By 2020, that figure had fallen below 3%. Roughly 800 million Chinese citizens were lifted out of extreme poverty in 4 decades. No other poverty reduction program in the history of Earth came close. The Chinese Communist Party still rules China. The hammer and sickle still appears on the flag, but the system that produced the
As much as China has problems, that's amazing. You have to give them praise for that. That turnaround's really amazing.
100 million person poverty reduction was exactly what communism had retreated from. They couldn't budget their grain, they couldn't budget their people, they couldn't budget their workforce, and they certainly couldn't budget their money. But you can, and tens of thousands of active monthly users are because they use DollarWise, the best automated budgeting app you could ever use. Most budgeting apps are way too complicated and people fall off the onboarding screen alone.
Usually I would skip over ads like this, but I think it's valuable to at least get out there. There are budgeting apps to help people. DollarWise is not the only one, it's just the one that she agrees most with. Like, there's also Monite that can be useful. I've seen other YouTubers be pro-Monite, but he's not, because he's against the... I'll pause it here. Because he thinks private equity that goes into Monite are not like the best with personal security. That's why he doesn't like it, or that's why he claims. But there are other economic content creators that will side with Monite.
The Soviet Union and the Maoist China account for the largest share of socialism's 20th century death toll. The rest is spread across smaller regimes whose individual numbers are smaller only by comparison. In Cambodia, a French-educated communist named Pol Pot seized power in April of 1975. They emptied the city of Phnom Penh in 72 hours, marching roughly 2 million people into the countryside at gunpoint. Over the following 3 years and 8 months, the regime executed or starved approximately 1.87 million Cambodians. The total population at the time was 7.89 million. They killed roughly 1 out of every 4 people in the country. In North Korea, the Kim dynasty has ruled an isolated command economy for 3 generations. Between 1994 and 1998, the regime produced a famine known as the Arduous March that killed between 600,000 and 1 million citizens, or 3 to 5% of the population. The surviving population today lives in a country with electricity for only a few hours a day, a GDP per capita of roughly $640 according to the Bank of Korea, and a dependence on United Nations food aid to prevent a repeat of the 90s. South Korea, sharing the same peninsula, the same language, the same culture, and the same history before 1945, has a GDP per capita of roughly $35,000. The gap between the two Koreas is visible from space in the famous satellite photographs showing the South lit up at night and the North as a black void.
That is really scary, especially when you can see the difference in space. So to me, like, the point would be like, when people are like, we should go socialism, it's more like, no. You want to go to show some what your real complaint is being against the current state of capitalism of the United States and how they're approaching their economic system. But socialism doesn't work. But what you can't advocate for is maybe some higher taxes, and with those high taxes pay for more safety nets for people. Social Security is going to default in like 5 years. It's actually a really bad situation with our debt. So you have to get used to the idea of you have to pay more taxes. But with those more taxes do come with more benefits.
East and West Germany ran the cleanest natural experiment in the history of economics. Identical culture, identical language, identical institutions before 1945. One half went capitalist, the other half went socialist. And by 1989, West German GDP per capita was around $28,000. East Germany GDP per capita was around $12,000. The population of East Germany fell from 18.4 million to 16.4 million over 4 decades because Germans kept fleeing west. The Berlin Wall was not built to keep West Germans out. East German authorities built the wall to keep East Germans in. At least 140 people were killed by East German border guards while trying to cross it. After the wall fell in November of 1989, Germans streamed west. The Hoover Institution noted afterward that no historian has ever documented crowds of Westerners demanding to be let into the East. And then there was Venezuela. In the 1970s, Venezuela.
Can you imagine if the United States was all of a sudden divided by South versus North, and people from the South get shot trying to move north? It's the way that, ideologically speaking, it's getting close to that. It's trying to quite a situation. I wish people tone down the temperature with different political views. Feels like it sometimes, yeah. I know it's not literally gonna happen, but yeah, it does. Especially with the, what do you call it? Exchange of ideas, let's put it that way. When it comes to exchange of ideas and debates, it feels like that, yes.
was the 4th wealthiest country on Earth per capita. It sat atop 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest on the planet. Venezuelan oil wealth funded an American-style middle class.
No. If you're talking about history, the Civil War just happened. It's close to that, yes. The North accepted the South, but the South are like, no, there's our slaves. You can't take them from us. It did happen in history, though. Hello, Senor. Glad you can join. I'm trying something different, so what I'm doing here is I'm actually doing my trading, earning money, while trying to talk about economics and stuff.
Class, a modern capital.
No, so we're watching here as people misunderstanding socialism. Like, there's people in the United States saying, we need to become socialist, we need to become socialist. And this again details why socialism doesn't work and why people are confused and not saying what they mean when they're saying we want socialism.
In Caracas and the reputation as the jewel of Latin America. In 1998, Venezuelans elected a former military officer named Hugo Chavez on a promise to redistribute the oil wealth to the poor. Chavez began what he called Bolivarian Revolution. He nationalized the state oil company PDVSA, purged thousands of its experienced managers and engineers in 2003, and replaced them with political loyalists. He imposed price controls on.
See, right there, you basically fight all the experts, and then you hire people to kiss your foot, or whatever. How else do you say that? Sniffer or something. That's not how you want the economy. That's America and
medicine and basic goods. He nationalized farms, factories, steel mills, and banks. He used oil revenue to fund a sprawling network of social programs called the Misiones. While oil prices stayed above $100 a barrel, it looked like the revolution was working. Poverty rates fell. GDP per capita climbed from roughly $4,000 in 1999 to $14,200 by 2013. Celebrities flew to Caracas to praise the project. Sean Penn, Oliver Stone, Michael Moore, Naomi Klein, Jeremy Corbyn, and Danny Glover all issued public endorsements of the Chavez government at various points. Danny Glover personally received $18 million in Venezuelan state funding for a film that was never released. In 2013, Chavez died of cancer. His vice president, Nicolas Maduro, took over. In the same year, global oil prices began a long decline. The structural damage of 15 years of price controls, nationalizations, and purge expertise was suddenly exposed. Venezuelan oil production cratered because the engineers who knew how to run the refineries had been fired a decade earlier. Farms nationalized from their owners stopped producing because the new state-appointed managers had no idea how to farm. Price controls made every product unprofitable to produce, so private companies stopped producing. Supermarket shelves emptied. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Toilet paper became so scarce that in 2013, the Venezuelan government temporarily seized a toilet paper factory and placed it under military occupation, on the grounds that the factory must be sabotaging the revolution. GDP per capita collapsed from $14,200 in 2013 to roughly $1,800 by 2019, an 87% decline. Inflation in 2018 reached 130,000% according to the Central Bank of Venezuela, and nearly 1,000,000% according to the International Monetary Fund. Venezuelans reported an average weight loss of 24 pounds in a single year, a phenomenon researchers call the Maduro diet.
So, now you know the details on that insane inflation story. Even back then when I was hearing about this crazy inflation numbers, I'm like, how did that happen? What the frick?
Zoo animals were stolen and eaten. The Caracas City Zoo lost its collection of peacocks, pigs, and Vietnamese pigs over the course of several months in 2016. By 2024, 7.4 million Venezuelans had fled the country. That is roughly 25% of the entire population. It is the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere, and all of it happened in a country sitting on the largest oil reserves on Earth. The celebrities who had praised Chavez went quiet. Jeremy Corbyn's 2012 article titled "Venezuela is Seriously Conquering Poverty by Emphatically Rejecting Neoliberal Policies" was quietly removed from his website. Sean Penn stopped doing interviews about Caracas. And then the "this isn't real socialism" explanations began. The phrase "that wasn't real socialism" has a specific technical name in philosophy. Philosophers call it the no true Scotsman fallacy. A defender of a proposition claims that all Scotsmen put sugar in their porridge. A critic points out that his uncle Angus is a Scotsman and does not put sugar in his porridge. The defender replies that no true Scotsman would do such a thing, and therefore Uncle Angus does not count. The socialism version of this move has been running for over a century. Bernie Sanders honeymooned in Yaroslav in the Soviet Union in June of 1988 and held a press conference afterwards praising Moscow's subway fares and housing costs. A year later, Sanders visited Cuba and reported that he had never seen a hungry child or a homeless person under Fidel Castro. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, defended the Soviet Union through 1956. Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman publicly cast doubt on early reports of the Cambodian atrocities in a 1977 essay in The Nation. The pattern is almost mechanical. The regime rises, Western intellectuals praise it as the future, the regime produces famines, purges, or refugee flows, and the intellectuals go silent. New people, unaware of the previous cycle, discover a new regime and declares it the real thing this time. And the theoretical rebuttal is also equally mechanical. A defender insists that the real version has never been tried. Asked what the real version would look like, the answer is almost always Denmark, Sweden, or Norway, which are not socialist countries by any economic definition. Pressed on why every actual attempt at state ownership of production has produced the same results, the answer shifts to corruption, imperialism, sanctions, or bad luck. The problem with all of these explanations is that they are structural, not incidental. Handing a small group of human beings unchecked control over an entire economy produces the same result every time.
So, what he's explaining here is we kind of went over earlier, where in order to have a socialist, by the socialist definition of an economic system, you have to have some kind of force to push everyone along on the central vision, because the idea of socialism is that like one central committee or whatever controls everything. So you have to have some kind of force to impose on all the collective agreements, and as we saw, explain over and over again on why that fails. Like you have people being fired, even though they're experts, and you're putting political loyalists when you should have technical knowledge in the field.
The control concentrates, the incentives corrode, the information disappears, and the repression begins. This has happened in Moscow, Beijing, Havana, Pyongyang, Cambodia, and Caracas, not by accident. The same thing happens when 20 million prices get replaced by one committee. The system itself is the problem, and the leader of any given iteration is a symptom of that system. The positive record of market capitalism over the same period is almost the mirror image. The World Bank tracks a figure called extreme poverty, currently defined as living on less than $3 a day in 2021 purchasing power. In 1920, roughly 84 to 90% of the human species lived below that line. By 1990, the global rate was still 38%, or 2 billion people. By 2024, the figure had fallen to approximately 8.5%, or 690 million people. In a single generation, roughly 1.5 billion human beings were lifted out of extreme poverty. The primary driver wasn't foreign aid, or redistribution, or central planning. It was market capitalism spreading across Asia that did the work. China alone accounted for roughly 800 million of those gains, and China did it by moving away from the system it officially still claimed to follow. Vietnam eliminated almost all of its poverty between 1993 and 2020 through the same path. Agricultural reforms, private enterprise, foreign investment, export markets. Vietnamese manufactured exports grew roughly 20% a year between 2000 and 2019. India also ran this experiment publicly. In July of 1991, India's foreign currency reserves fell to $1.2 billion, enough.
This is the thing that actually gets on my nerves sometimes, because of my name. I have replies, like, you're communist, you Chinese communist. And it's like, China's not even communist, it's actually a market economy. That's why they were able to lift so many people out of poverty, because it went to like capitalist market economy. It's a controlled capitalist economy, but still capitalism.
To cover 3 weeks of imports. The government airlifted 67 tons of gold to London as collateral on an emergency IMF loan. The finance minister, who is an economist, delivered a budget speech that dismantled what was called the license Raj, a 40-year-old system of central licensing that controlled almost every aspect of Indian industry. Tariffs fell from over 150% to 30%. The list of industries requiring a state license fell from nearly all to just 6. Over the 3 decades that followed, roughly 270 million Indians were lifted out of poverty. India became the 5th largest economy on Earth. No comparable poverty reduction has ever been recorded in the other direction.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. I think people, when they talk about improvements, India had made great strides with that too. It's amazing what India has achieved too. I think people undersell and misrepresent India's situation too.
The Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, which measures property rights, trade openness, regulatory burden, and government size across roughly 180 countries every year, finds that the freest quarter of economies average a GDP per capita of around $120,000 in purchasing power terms. The least free quarter averages around $10,600, a ratio of more than 10 to 1. The Fraser Institute, an independent Canadian think tank, produces a separate index with similar methodology and reaches substantially the same conclusion. Life expectancy globally rose from roughly 38 years in 1800 to 73.2 years in 2000.
Unlike my background knowledge with the Heritage Foundation, I have no idea who is the Fraser Institute is. I did not do research on them at all, but it's still interesting that they came up with these similar figures. I'm probably gonna research more into that myself, but But it sounds logically sound anyway, so I didn't bother much with it. I don't like their explanation, but this specific thing makes sense.
Child mortality fell from 43% of children dying before the age of 5 to roughly 3.7% today. Global literacy rose from 12% to 87%. Global caloric intake rose from about 2,200 calories per person per day to almost 3,000. Economists call this period the Great Enrichment. Per capita GDP on Earth has risen roughly 30-fold since 1800. Most mainstream economists agree that almost all of that gain occurred in economies organized around private property, voluntary exchange, and market prices. Now, this record is not without real problems. American income equality rose sharply after 1980. The Gini coefficient, a standard measure of inequality, rose from roughly 0.397 in 1967 to roughly 0.49 in 2023. The top one...
I have a little question for you. Even though there's other complicated situations, but there's a key here in 1980. Wait, what happens in 1980s? Like early 1980s. Does anything ring a bell? I'm curious. I see you can spot something. It's not, I'll say it. I'm just curious. Collapse the Soviets. No, that actually came later. The thing is, the full collapse didn't take place until a bit later. It's actually, the thing with the Soviet Union, if you consider the Soviet Union and Russia's actually not that old. You know, people, I went to Twitter talking about the age of like countries, compared to the United States, how the United States is so young. But the thing is, if you compare it to the longevity of like having a strong currency within global trade, or having like a government system, the United States is actually one of the older countries. People really misunderstand that a lot. So, basically, depending on like when you classify a current state of government compared to, you know, the full length of the outstanding government, it's basically Japan, China, United States, and ancient Rome. Those four. Those are pretty long. How long they lasted, like those two are very competitive, like long-lasting systems. Japan is actually technically a little younger because of like when they went through their revolution. It was basically on after World War II when they got nuked. But yeah, but Japan is still kind of up there, but China with their global presence over in the silverback is around 500 years or so. So yeah, 500 years of China, 250 United States, and then like 7 or 8 years with Japan. And other countries have been reformed much earlier than that, like Russia's like 25 years old or something like that. Like the Russia Federation completely went under. But basically what I was getting at with my question is circle down economics. Reagan, the wealth, you know, the top brackets went from like 70% tax. So say your first million, you're paying taxes like everyone else, like the first 10,000, it's not tax, whatever. I'm not sure if I fully read how brackets work. But after like $1 million, that the upper brackets were like taxed at like 70%, 70. It's really, really high. And then Ronald Reagan's like basically sliced that in half. So a lot of economic reforms that happened under Reagan still haunt us today from the trickle-down economic concepts. And that was a large influence on the wealth gap I can't speak. Disparity colonizer. There's other smaller factors with that as well. I just thought I would give that something to think about that. Well, Reagan's trickle-down economics had a big influence with that. Disparity, yes.
10% of earners went from 8% of national income in the late 1970s to over 20% by the 2010s, back to levels recorded during the Gilded Age. American housing became dramatically less affordable. American healthcare spending hit 18% of GDP without producing the longevity outcomes of peer countries. The opioid crisis, driven in part by private marketing of a prescription painkiller called Oxycontin, killed more than 800,000 Americans between 1999 and 2022. None of those failures is a failure of market capitalism as a system. Every one of them traces back to a place where the American version of capitalism has become distorted. Housing in American cities got expensive because zoning laws, restrictive permitting, and local political capture block new construction, not because markets failed. Harvard economist Ed Glazer estimates that in constrained coastal cities, the zoning tax, meaning the gap between what a house costs and what it would cost to build, now exceeds 50% of the home's value. Healthcare in America got expensive because roughly half of it runs through government programs and the other half is shaped by federal tax subsidies or employer-sponsored insurance, a system in which the market barely functions. The 2008 financial crisis was another government-driven failure. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission concluded in January of 2011 that the crisis resulted from regulatory capture, government-backed mortgage securitization, and Federal Reserve interest rate policy that fueled the bubble. The phrase for the system that produces those outcomes is crony capitalism, a specific American distortion of market capitalism. The cure is more competition and less government picking of winners. But almost nobody is teaching this distinction to the generation now rising. In January of 2024, a data journalist at the Financial Times named John Byrne Murdoch published a chart. Using data from Gallup in the United States, the British Election Study in the United Kingdom, Albus in Germany, and the Korean Social Survey Center in South Korea, Byrne Murdoch showed that young women aged 18 to 30 were now roughly 30 percentage points more liberal than young men of the same age in the United States. The gap had opened in 6 years. In 2017, young men and young women held roughly the same political views. By 2023, the canyon between them was the widest such gap Gallup had ever recorded. Germany showed the same pattern with a gap of about 30 points. The United Kingdom, about 20.
See what I mean by worldwide? This is the details that I was referring to earlier. But yeah, it's actually a worldwide phenomenon. It's just not in the United States that these gaps are getting bigger. I think one of the Koreas has even bigger. Let's see, does he might look up in there.
5. South Korea, the most extreme example on Earth, about 4.
Yeah, South Korea. Look at that. It's like... Look at the year. Look, they were still kind of close in 2015. This is pretty recent. Like it. Yeah.
In South Korea's 2022 presidential election, 59% of men in their 20s voted for the conservative candidate Yoon Suk-yeol. Between 59 and 66% of women in their 20s voted for the liberal candidate Lee Jae-myung, a gender gap of nearly 37 points in a single cohort. Something happened to Western young women between 2015 and 2024 that did not happen to Western young men. A combination of ideology, campus culture, digital ecosystem, and real economic strain, and roughly Roughly, that order of casual weight pulled half of a generation sharply to the left, while the other half held steady or moved right. The ideology comes from the university system. Women now earn approximately 60% of bachelor's degrees in the United States, up from roughly 40% in 1970. They are concentrated in humanities and social sciences, where the political ratios of faculty skews furthest from the national average. The economist Mitchell Langbert surveyed 51 elite liberal arts colleges in 2018 and found a Democrat to Republican ratio of 12.7 to 1 overall, with anthropology at 133 to 1, communications at 108 to 0, interdisciplinary studies at 108 to 0, sociology at roughly 44 to 1, and history at roughly 33 to 1. Wellesley College ran at 136 to 1. Swarthmore ran at 120 to 1. At Harvard, the Crimson surveyed the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and found 82% of professors identifying as liberal or very liberal. 1% identified as conservative. For context, the American public at large identifies roughly 37% conservative, 37% moderate, and 26% liberal. The Harvard faculty is the mathematical inverse of the country it teaches. The curriculum followed the demographics. Women's and gender studies departments grew out of the second wave feminism of the 1970s. Over 50 years, their intellectual framework absorbed critical theory, post-structuralism, and socialist and Marxist feminism. The theory of intersectionality, coined by the legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989, spread outward from women's studies into the rest of the humanities and now shapes how most elite college students analyze power and wealth. A student trained in that framework learns to read her own economic frustrations as a system of structural oppression. The gender pay gap, the student loan crisis, the housing crisis, the climate crisis, and the reproductive rights debate arrive in the same conceptual package. The package names the villain in advance, and that villain is capitalism. Roughly 25 states no longer require a high school course in economics.
See, there all these red squares. I'm not sure what a blue square. I'm not sure what a blue square schooling would be like, but growing up in a red square, the economic ignorance is insane, and that's why Tellum has this show to begin with, is because people don't know how to respect money and budget. The thing is, let me get this executed and I'll explain something. Yes, someone will say something. So, this is being so much. What was I gonna say is, there's some back-end on why they don't teach it. So in the United States, our schooling is actually based on repetitive factory work. Like the foundation of our schooling is, how they ring the bell, you go switch to place, ring, 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 ring. Then that's, brings, a certain discipline skill set that you found factory work. So you have the schooling system foundation factory work and the women training to sew and stuff. This is all 1920s or whatever, where women are more housework and sewing and such. So our schooling still has that as a foundation. And that's why they don't teach it. They're more focused on memorization and factory work type setting education rather than teaching how to think. And that's a reform I would love to see happen. I don't want an education system I'll tell you how to think and memorization. I want to teach people how to think. Kind of like I did with you, with showing you different stock issues. I was showing you this stock is low because this situation, this situation, people take risk, but yeah, I want schooling more about how to think critically, not telling you how to, teach you how to think, not teaching you what to think.
At all, down from 28 in 2014. Most American students graduate college without ever reading any major normal economists. Instead, they graduate having read Marx, Marcuse, Crenshaw, Judith Butler, and Naomi Klein. And then there's the algorithm. Pew Research documents a sharply gendered platform geography. Teen girls use Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat at substantially higher rates than teen boys. Teen boys dominate YouTube, Discord, Twitch, and Reddit.
This is kind of interesting too. Gender gap between like YouTube, Discord, Twitch, Reddit, Instagram, 2000 shit. So this can also lead to echo chambers as well. That's because of the gender gap that spans through these platforms. And the thing with TikTok, Snapchat, and all that stuff, even like Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, X, they really encourage bros to have, and then, you know, you have to look a certain way, you know, you have to look like this, and it's like some females end up ending themselves because they can't look the perfect cut, you know?
The political content that flourishes on Instagram and TikTok runs heavily left. Instagram slide deck activists, accounts that went viral during 2020 and 2022, accounts like Impact, So You Want to Talk About, and Shit You Could Care About, each reached 2 to 3.5 million followers. The TikTok hashtags Eat the Rich and Late Stage Capitalism accumulated billions of cumulative views. The streamy left has its own celebrities. Hassan Piker, a socialist Twitch streamer with 3 million followers, drew over 300,000 concurrent viewers on election night of 2024. In October of 2020,
he said something. I think Hassan Piker is the one with the guy with the taser. He done some really questionable
Piker
things.
co-streamed the video game Among Us with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar to nearly 700,000 concurrent viewers. The essayist ContraPoints, whose real name is Natalie Wynn, has 1.9 million YouTube subscribers. PhilosophyTube, produced by Abigail Thorne, has 1.5 million. Counterweights on the male spectrum.
I actually listened to those two before. They actually make I actually like some of their some things they actually said.
Whose real name is Natalie Wynn.
I'm surprised he brings them up.
1.9 million YouTube
Let's see what he does with this.
subscribers. PhilosophyTube, produced by Abigail Thorne, has 1.5 million. The counterweights on the male spectrum of the platform geography are people like Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Theo Vaughn, Lex Freedom, pull in the opposite direction, but for Lex and Theo, they actually have some left-wing political views, and Joe Rogan is considered pretty centrist unless you're far right or far left. But in the end, the result is two ideologically separated information economies running in parallel, sorted by platform preference.
The problem I have with Joe Rogan is, see, he tries to, promote, like, a whole bunch of different people, and he doesn't have enough scientific intelligence to push back on some people, and, I just don't like some of the things he wears.
A young woman scrolling TikTok at night and a young man scrolling X at night are increasingly receiving different facts about the same country. The material backdrop is real, but it matters less than the ideology and the algorithm, because men face most of the same material conditions and do not reach the same political conclusions. The housing crisis, the student debt overhang, and the childcare squeeze affect both sexes. The median American home price climbed 48% between 2019 and 2024, while median household income rose 22%. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies measures the home price to income ratio at 5.0, the worst reading since the series began. Only 3% of American home buyers belong to Generation Z. 67% of Gen Z adults struggle to cover their monthly housing costs. And then student loan debt breaks the entire thing. Total U.S. student loan debt stands at roughly 1.7.
It can be funny watching some of these famous podcasters talk about economics issues, like, what's his name? Asmongold, one time I saw a random video by Asmongold, and he's looking at Zach Child McDonald's. He's like, wow, what happened here? As the end of 2022, and it took like a big huge crash, and it's like, that's October 2022. They had a very bad CPI number, and everything tanked in the morning. And like everything died in the morning. And then at the end of the day, everything's back to normal. You know, basically where it opened is really unreal. My jaw dropped seeing that day. Let's see if I can actually pull this up. But yeah, it's very funny for me to hear somebody. Yeah, he's like, what do they have? Run on McDonald's burgers or something? But it's like, no, that's just from CPA. Let's go to 2022. This is all I told me. Maybe you're here? The 14th? Yeah, that's crazy though. Shooting and the next day opens up there and just runs up there. Since that point, that's really crazy at CPI day. Yeah.
Trillion across 42.7 million borrowers. Women hold approximately 2/3 of that total, or $929 billion, partially because women attend college at higher rates and partially because their chosen fields pay less. Childcare has become the squeeze at the next stage of life. Childcare Aware of America reports average annual childcare costs of $13,128 per child, a 13% one-year jump, with care for 2 children now exceeding annual mortgage payments in 45 states, plus the District of Columbia. Those are real pressures, and the cheaper explanation for why women respond to them politically and men do not is not the pressure themselves. Men feel them too. The explanation is that women spend 5 more years on average inside institutions that teach them to interpret those pressures through a Marxist-adjacent framework, and then spend several hours a day on platforms that reinforce that interpretation. The material conditions are the fuel. The campus and the algorithm are the spark. The scholar Rob Henderson has a useful phrase for the pattern: luxury beliefs. Henderson, who grew up in foster care and later studied at Yale and Cambridge, observed that as material luxuries like cars and handbags have become commoditized, the upper middle class has shifted to signaling status through beliefs, proportions that counter cultural distinction at low personal cost but impose high costs on people who actually try to live by them. Support for defunding police in the 2020 YouGov polling was strongest among the wealthiest Americans and weakest among the poor, despite the poor being 3 to 7 more times likely to be crime victims. Open-ended redistribution follows a similar curve. Young women in the Harvard poll who describe themselves as struggling financially are slightly less pro-socialist than young women in the same poll who describe themselves as doing well. The data economist Claudia Golden of Harvard won the 2023 Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on the gender pay gap. Golden's research produced a finding that cuts against the headline numbers most Americans lean. The headline American pay gap, the number quoted on protest signs and social media graphics, is that women earn 83 cents for every dollar.
So, like he's explaining, there is like nuance with these numbers, but people don't learn these nuances and they just run with the worst number.
Dollar a man earns. That number is a raw average of all women's full-time earnings against all men's full-time earnings. It is technically accurate and casually misleading. Golden controlled for hours worked, occupation, industry, experience, and family status. The gap closed to between 94 and 99 cents on the dollar for young, childless workers. Most of what remains of the gap, Golden showed, opens at the birth of the first child and reflects something Golden called greedy work, meaning the premium that law, finance, consulting, and corporate jobs pay for long, inflexible hours that mothers typically cannot accept. The 99-cent figure is not widely taught in American high schools or colleges. The 83-cent figure is. Young women learn at age 16 that the economy is rigged against them by gender alone. Most of them never learn the refinement. They carry the 83-cent figure with them into their 30s and build their politics on it. The actual problem, the data shows, the motherhood penalty and the structure of greedy work would be better addressed by policies like paid parental leave, childcare subsidies, and workplace flexibility. Those are standard social democratic policies that do not require.
See, this is the problem with these echo chambers. Like, they don't actually learn the true problems and what they can actually address. Like, parental leave is a big policy that can actually benefit men and women. Like, say if you have a stay-at-home dad or whatever, he can get parental leave to help care for the child as the mom works more. So, this could be a dual gender policy, but people run with the half information.
Nationalizing industry. Denmark, Sweden, and Germany all provide them without abolishing markets. But the package Americans typically encounter online replaces all of that nuance with a simpler claim. The system is rigged, the system needs replacing, and the replacement is socialism. The young men, meanwhile, are having a different crisis in the same house. Richard Reeves, a scholar at the American Institute for Boys and Men, has documented the male half of the story. Men's real wages have declined roughly 14% since 1979. Millions of prime-age men are out of the labor force entirely. Non-college men face what the sociologist William Julius Wilson in 1987 called an unmarriageable trajectory, meaning their economic prospects are too weak to attract a long-term partner. The median age of first marriage in America has risen to 30 for men and 28 for women, from 25 and 23 in 1980.
In my opinion, this number increasing is not that of a bad thing. Like, it being 2022, to me that's too low. It probably should be around 26 or 29. But now it's getting a little too high, I think.
Marriage in America has risen to 30 for men and 28 for women, from 25 and 23 in 1980. The Institute for Family Studies projects that roughly 1 in 3 young American adults today will never marry at all. Women outnumber men on college campuses
especially
by
when it comes to the gender
Statistically,
gap.
millions of college-educated young women in America cannot find a college-educated male peer who is single, employed, and interested. The demographic math alone produces a politically charged single female cohort, and then the politics get charged further. Surveys by the American Enterprise Institute find that over 50% of young liberal women say they would not date a Trump voter. That preference has real demographic consequences. In 2024, 56% of American men aged 18 to 29 voted for Donald Trump. So in functional terms, the majority of male peers that young liberal women would consider dating have already been politically eliminated. But there is some contradiction in the poll numbers. Young American women tell pollsters they favor socialism in record numbers. The same young women also tell pollsters they distrust the government, the media, the universities, and both major political parties in record numbers. The Harvard Institute of Politics 2025 Youth Poll found that only 13% of young Americans believed the country was headed in the right direction. 58% used a negative word to describe the Democratic Party. 56% used a negative word to describe the Republican Party. 40% used a negative word for both parties simultaneously. The same Harvard poll found support for socialism among young Americans had fallen to 21% in 2025, down from its previous highs. Support for democratic socialism sat at 29%. Identification as capitalists had fallen to 19%. Gallup's 2025 polling found that overall, Americans still viewed capitalism more favorably than socialism by 54 to 39%. The data actually shows something different from a generation that has read Marx and agreed. It shows a generation that has rejected every single existing label. They call themselves socialist because the word points at the problems they feel are real and because the word annoys the people they blame for those problems. In other surveys, depending on how the question is worded, they also call themselves pro-capitalist. The belief system is not doctrinal. It is a protest vote in search of a label. The 2014 Reason poll found that 42% of millennials favored socialism, while only 16% could define it, set the template for every poll.
Basically, more sarcastic origins and yeah.
The word has become a vessel for economic frustration, not a description of a system the speakers actually want. But votes are still votes, and policy demands are still policy demands. And the demographic pressure, however vague its intellectual foundation, will shape the next 15 years of Western politics. The arithmetic will not permit the policy package its youngest voters are demanding. The numbers I'm about to go over will explain why. You see, the national debt as of April 2026 stands at roughly $39 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio sits at approximately 120%. The Congressional Budget Office projects that number rising to 156% by 2055 under current law, without adding a single new program. Net interest on existing federal debt passed $1 trillion a year in 2025. That is more than the United States spends on its defense. It is the third largest line item in the federal budget after Social Security and Medicare. The CBO projects net interest will double to roughly $2.1 trillion a year by 2036. The structural driver isn't discretionary spending, it is mandatory entitlement growth, and it is demographic. By 2050, roughly 22% of the American population will be over the age of 65. There will be 2.5 times as many Americans over 85 as there are today. Medicare and Medicaid spending will rise approximately 73% over the next decade. Social Security's trust fund is projected to hit insolvency in 2033, at which point the law automatically cuts benefits by 23%.
This is what I was talking about. That's what I was trying to make a reference earlier about. I think I misquoted the exact date. I said 2030 something. Man said 2032. My bad. But yeah, 2033, the Social Security will actually hit insolvency, and this is a big issue.
Medicare's hospital trust fund hits the same wall the same year with an automatic 11% benefit cut. Into that arithmetic, young voters are asking for Medicare for all, which the Congressional Budget Office and several independent analyses project would cost between $30 and $40 trillion over the first decade. They also want free college, cancellation of $1.7 trillion in existing student debt, a Green New Deal whose advocates themselves estimate the 10-year cost at roughly $90 trillion, universal pre-K, universal childcare, housing subsidies, and expanded paid leave. The math doesn't work. Taxing every American billionaire at 100%, seizing every dollar of their net worth produces roughly $5 trillion, a one-time sum that would cover approximately 18 months of current deficit spending and then be gone forever. The only honest way to fund a much larger welfare state are broad-based tax increases on the middle class, like the 25% value-added tax that finances the Danish system, or aggressive cuts to the entitlement programs the same voters want expanded. Neither option is politically available to either party. The system will most likely continue to borrow. The debt will continue to rise. Interest payments will continue to consume more of the federal budget. And eventually, something will give. The IMF warned in April of 2026.
This is why, especially if you consider see, Donald Trump himself, quoted he want a weaker, US dollar for, like, trade. So if you pair that with the tariff policy, you basically conclude he wants to inflate the debt away. So if you have a $39 trillion of debt, and the worth of the dollar is like 5% worse, it's 25, and yeah, it's 5%. It's worth less than compared to your prior. That makes the debt. That actually makes the debt easier to manage.
That global public debt has risen to just under 94% of GDP in 2025 and is on track to hit 100% by 2029. The United States is not alone in this trajectory, but the United States is farther along than almost any peer country in the group of 7, and its political class is less able to agree on any fiscal correction at all. The optimistic scenario is a phenomenon some analysts have called supply-side progressivism, or abundance politics. The policy bundle includes dramatic liberalization of zoning so housing supply can finally catch up with demand, expansion of energy production, reform of healthcare delivery, and large-scale investment in infrastructure. Paired with modest expansion of the safety net financed by broad-based consumption taxes, not wealth taxes, it would offer young voters the outcomes they want without the fiscal suicide of the purer socialist program. The YIMBY movement, which stands for Yes in My Backyard, has already won real victories in Minneapolis, Austin, and even in California. But the pessimistic scenario is fiscal crisis, a movement probably within the next 15 years in which the Treasury market loses confidence in the United States' ability to service its debt at current interest rates. At that point, the politically impossible choices become suddenly mandatory, meaning benefits get cut, taxes get raised, the dollar loses reserve status, and the post-war American economic order begins to unwind. Britain had a shadow of that moment in September of 2022 after Liz Truss's mini budget triggered a gilt market panic and collapsed her government within 49 days. A United States version would be globally systemic, and looming over both scenarios is AI. Economist Darren Ajimolu and Pascal Estrepo published research in the Journal of Political Economy in 2020 showing that each additional industrial robot per 1,000 American workers reduced the employment to population ratio by 0.2 percentage points and wages by 0.42%, with the effect concentrated on blue-collar non-college workers. Goldman Sachs estimated in March of 2023 that roughly 300 million full-time equivalent jobs globally could be exposed to generative AI. If AI productivity gains accrue overwhelmingly to capital owners while displacing workers, political demand for redistribution will intensify regardless of what the younger generation currently thinks about socialism. Sam Altman of OpenAI has already pushed universal basic income into the mainstream conversation. Andrew Yang ran for president on a similar platform in 2020. The AI shock, if it arrives at scale, could force redistribution on any.
In other words, AI drives people out of work. People want more socialism, more progress, more universal income-like systems.
Ideological basis. But strip away the polling, the TikTok algorithms, the Instagram side decks, the college curricula, and the celebrity endorsements, and the argument between capitalism and socialism reduces to a single question about who decides. Under market capitalism, decisions are made by millions of individuals acting on their own knowledge, their own preferences, and their own budgets coordinated by prices. The system makes mistakes constantly because every individual makes mistakes. Mistakes are small, local, and correctable. A restaurant that serves bad food food loses customers. A factory that produces the wrong product goes bankrupt. A bad idea dies quietly, and a good idea spreads because other people copy it. The whole system learns. Under socialism, decisions are made by a small group of planners who set the same policy for everyone at once. The system makes mistakes as well. The mistakes are large, systemic, and nearly impossible to correct because admitting them would undermine the authority of the planners. One bad policy
This has a lot of big truth highlighting this, like I was saying, is that Spiro and the mosquito thing. So, you had this central so-called expert saying, no, you have to kill all the Spiros. And even if you have a smart person to object to that, saying, no, we need the Spiros to eat the locusts. And they're like, and the discourse of that would be like you say on Twitter, no, you're an idiot, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. Don't listen to that locust lover or Spiro lover. That's a Spiro lover. Because the Spiros are against the state. You must eliminate the Spiros. So that's why it's this idea of having a central committee, like a select few people, and rule on the full economy doesn't work. Will that change with AI though? That's the million-dollar question. Like to hell's Llama not needing a middleman because it's its own middleman, because it collects all this data and would just sell things and whatnot.
kills the sparrows, another empties the supermarkets, another marches 2 million people out of the capital in 72 hours. The whole system breaks. Friedrich Hayek published a book in 1944 called The Road to Serfdom. Hayek argued that central economic planning eventually requires political coercion because planning needs enforcement and enforcement needs a corrosive state. The history of every socialist regime had validated that prediction. The Soviet Union needed the Cheka and later the KGB. Maoist China needed the Red Guards. Castro's Cuba needed the Comités de Defensa de la Revolución. Pol Pot's Cambodia needed the Senegal security apparatus. Maduro's Venezuela needed the Sabine intelligence service. The Nordic countries,
So like I was saying earlier, and he was kind of touched up on earlier. In order to have an exact rule of socialism, you need some kind of enforcement to make everyone play along with the system. And that sort of a totalitarian feel behind the authoritarianism. So that's another reason why it's
young American voters point to as their model represent something different from socialism succeeding. They are examples of market capitalism with generous welfare states layered on top, funded by broad-based consumption taxes on working people, and defended by democratic institutions that nobody in the Kremlin or Beijing ever possessed. The Nordic model is what social democrats settle for after they win, not what socialists promise. The gap between what young Western women want and what socialism has ever actually delivered is the largest intellectual fault line in Western politics, wider than the gap between the parties, wider than the gap between religious and the secular. A narrower gap separates the generations. That fault line will close one way or another in the next 20 years. The most likely path will be neither a triumph for socialism nor a victory for capitalism. It is a long, bitter, contested hybrid. Expect more industrial policy, more arguments over family benefits and childcare, more housing intervention, more skepticism of big corporations, more selective public ownership in strategic sectors, and stronger workplace bargaining. Expect also a sharp counter-movement from the right, offering pro-family tax relief, housing supply reform, anti-monopoly policy, tariffs, industrial subsidies, and a language of market renewal rather than abolishing markets. The side that wins will be the side that improves ordinary life without reproducing the old socialist pathologies of control, scarcity, and dependency. The Prime Minister of Denmark told a room at Harvard in 2015 that that Denmark was not a socialist country. And 9 years later, 6 out of 10 young American adults told pollsters that socialism was a good idea. By April of 2026, the American national debt passed $39 trillion, and the Social Security Trust Fund is scheduled to go insolvent in 2033. The young American women voting for a system that killed 65 million people in the last century have a point about the American economy failing them, but they're wrong about the cause, and they are wrong about the curve. The cause is a specifically American form of crony capitalism that has captured housing, healthcare, higher education, and childcare, precisely the sectors where government, not the markets, dominates. The cure is more market capitalism directed at the sectors where the distortion is worst. The most important sentence a Western politician could say right now is the one that Lars Rasmussen said at Harvard in 2015. Denmark is a market economy. Its welfare state is funded out of the productivity of that market economy. There is no shortcut, no alternative history in which the productivity comes from somewhere else. Every country that tried the shortcut is either on a list of former countries or on a list of famines. The choice facing the West is not between capitalism and socialism. It is between a capitalism honest enough to reform its cronyist distortions and a political class willing to keep promising the young what no system can.
Like the USSR, there's a reason why it's a former country.
Deliver without a 25% sales tax that no American politician has the courage to propose. Time is shorter than anyone wants to admit. The debt, the demographic collapse, and the AI shock are all arriving at once. The trust fund walls of 2033 are now 7 years away. The young women demanding a rebrand of a system that killed tens of millions of their grandmother's generation are going to inherit the consequences of whichever version wins and whichever version loses. Whatever comes next will not be called socialism. It will not be called capitalism either. The name will be whatever the generation alive at the time decides to call it. And the generation now entering adulthood armed with TikTok, trained in intersectional theory, saddled with debt, and priced out of the property market their parents owned at their age is going to do the naming. And we'll be there to cover that. I'll see you in the next one. I'll be candid. Front Page loses money. The cost of research, audio editing, video editing, and everything else that goes into this project is substantial. I believe the neutral and...
So, what are your thoughts about my comments to all this? Anything stand up?